Welcome back to Sika Strength and welcome back to Sika Stan. I'm Owen. This is Dara, and we are powerlifting coaches who've had the pleasure of coaching a lot of different athletes across a variety of different abilities. And today we're going to be using John Haack's peak for his best performance ever, and technically, arguably, the best powerlifting performance ever, where we're just going to talk to you some of the good principles you need for a peak for your powerlifting meet. Now, just go over the numbers John Haack did. He weighed in at 93.4 kilos. He squatted 365 kilos. John squats high bar as well, just in case you didn't know. He benched 252.5 kilos, which is arguably a bad bench day for John. And he deadlifted a lifetime PR in competition and training PR of 426 kilos conventional in the competition. So this was his best competition ever. This gave him the best ranked dots on open powerlifting across all classes, all years, and raw with wraps for a dots of 662.39. Now, we're very fortunate to live in an era where lots of great powerlifters are lifting, and lots of them document their process and some of their thoughts behind their training, which is invaluable for an athletes and coaches looking to increase their breadth of knowledge. Now, one of the most common things we'll see here, and John Haack talks about this, is having a bit of an RSI or an injury or pain leading into the competition. I would say with certainty, one of the things you will have in life is a death, taxes, and if you're a powerlifter peaking for a competition, you are going to have aches and pains. They could be anywhere from your shoulders, your calves, quads, back, anything is going to crop up. And the important thing here is you need to have mitigation strategies ready, not just for your peaking, but at all times for your training. Now, this could look like any number of strategies. This could be immediately calling your physio, your chiropractor, your neuromuscular therapist, your mother, someone who can help you with these injuries and pains. Some people like to immediately outsource these and go see that person who they trust. Maybe your coach is someone who's incredibly adept, if you have a coach, at solving these injuries after seeing a lot of different athletes. But the important thing then is to have a strategy available to you. So a lot of times, if we get aches and pains, this can impact our peak very poorly. This can impact our peak not at all, depending on what stage in our training this crops up. It can impact the peak in a variety of different sessions. And if we can reduce the number of sessions that are impacted by these pains, which sometimes and a lot of times we can if we're smart enough, if we can reduce them by a half or a third, if we go something like, if we didn't address the issue directly, if we trained through it, this might stay for the rest of the training block, or it might affect the next 6 or 7 or 8 squat sessions. Do you have 8 sessions to sacrifice for a squat? Probably not. That's quite a few. That could be a month worth of squatting. But if we can take that from, let's say, 8 squat sessions where we're altering our squat pattern, we're altering our loading negatively, we're in pain. If we could take that from 8 to 2 or 3, we've hugely increased the quality of our training. Now, a lot of times throughout training, people are worried about, oh, is this person on drugs? Is this powerlifter tested? I don't have the right training equipment. Is my program correct? But one of the big things that stops people's progress isn't that they've reached their genetic potential. Very often it's injuries reoccurring over and over again. And the big thing in powerlifting is when we're heading towards a peak, if something crops up, and if it crops up for long enough and it's of a big enough magnitude, it's very, very hard to get that peak back on course. So if we can go and address that issue, and if we can learn strategies, if we can read about them, watch, learn, go see someone, talk to experts, and have our own strategies. In this case, we can see John Haack foam rolling. He talks about having a quad injury, and he talks about specifically when he was squatting. And you can see him doing soft tissue work there, but you don't have to do foam rolling. You can go get soft tissue work. You can get a partner to walk on you. You can literally get physical therapy from someone. You can voodoo floss. You can use a massage gun. You can use BPC and TB 500, whatever that is for you, whatever you're doing with your training and your everything else around that. Having strategies to mitigate that and not training through them. There's a little bit of the anti-fragility community in powerlifting at times, but if you coach enough athletes and if you train enough, you know you're going to be in pain. And having sensible and reasonable mitigation strategies for this are so important. So this might seem like an abstract thought to be talking about in your peaking strategy, but one of the biggest things that drops off and deteriorates training for powerlifters is pain, and it's going to happen. You are guaranteed to get pain no matter what level you are, whether this is your first powerlifting comp or your 15th powerlifting comp. You are going to experience some kind of aches and pains. Some kind of owies are going to crop up in your powerlifting peak, and if you need to learn the best strategies for you, painkillers, ice, soft tissue work, whatever it is, I'd encourage you to start learning and seeing if you can find ways to address these issues and not training through them or ignoring them.
So the next thing we want to look at here is the Powerlifting Peak itself. So a lot of the time programming, or nearly all the time, programming across all strength training, across most sports, is incredibly simple. Most of the time you build up a certain amount of volume. So when we start our proper training phase, we start with quite high volume, quite low intensity, and both of those things invert as we get towards the end of the training cycle. Now, the start of the training cycle might look quite different depending on what kind of shape you're coming in at. So maybe if you've just come off at the back of another powerlifting competition, you're still in pretty good shape, you go straight into your 4 or 5 sets of 10 on the squat at 50%, say. But there's the other option there where maybe you've taken a bit of an off season, maybe you're on holidays for a while, and so now you're coming back in after not having trained for a month or two, and the initial phase of training will be more of a prep phase where you have to initially build up the volume. All of that being said, at the end of the training cycle, things look identically the same. So there are 1 rep max on the squat, 1 rep max on the bench press, and 1 rep max on the deadlift. How we get there is pretty simple. Now, the last week before we go and compete at a massive competition like this, or before we go and max out, is known as the taper. So usually we have a peaking phase, then a small taper afterwards, and this is basically the peak, or the top of the peak is when we're training at our highest intensity. Then we have a small taper back where we allow the body to recover, allow any of those niggles or aches and pains to subside slightly, and then we hit the absolute peak at the end of the taper. So it's very, very simple. We start with very high volume, comes down to low volume at the end, then we have a small bit of a break, and then we hit the absolute numbers. Now, the interesting thing of having this kind of insight from somebody like John Haack is that we get the real nitty gritty and fine details over how he peaks and how he tapers. Most of the kind of historically great powerlifters didn't share this level of detail with us, and it's really only in the last kind of 5 years we get the real nitty gritty and the real kind of day-to-day insight. So there's some real interesting things that pop up here when he talks about that taper. The first thing that pops up is in relation to his bench press. So he mentions that last year bench pressing wasn't something he really enjoyed. He had taken a bit of a step adjacent to powerlifting where he's doing a bit of strongman, wasn't really competition focused, and he really fell out of the groove or fell out of love with the bench press. Now, what he mentions here is that during this particular peak and during this particular training block, he got back into the groove with the bench press. It became something he really enjoyed doing again, to the point where it was probably his favorite lift to do in training. Now, the interesting side for me as a coach listening to this is that he mentions about the effective peaking and effective tapering he does for the bench press being different from what's effective for the squat and the deadlift. So what he says is, most of the heaviest bench presses he has ever hit is when he has had a second competition about 8 weeks after the first competition. So if you imagine we take that arbitrary training phase again, I have a big high peak, then I have my 1 week taper. The last 3 weeks of that peak are a lot of heavy singles, a lot of heavy high intensity low volume work. Then you have your taper where it's almost no volume, and then we compete. And then for the next 4 or 6 or 8 weeks, depending how close that second competition is, you're getting much more of those heavy doubles, heavy singles at relatively low volume. So when we get someone like John Haack, an incredible, one of the greats of the sport, talking about this, we start saying, okay, maybe there is something here. Maybe there is something to that slightly higher intensity with the bench press, probably slightly higher frequency with the bench press. That means you can train a bit more, a bit closer to competition at slightly higher percentages. So that's interesting when we look at that and we compare that to something like the deadlift. Obviously, he didn't say the same thing for the squat and the deadlift. His squat and his deadlifts, the heaviest ones, were hit in the initial competitions rather than the second competition following from the earlier peaks. Now, if you're looking at this and you're a recreational powerlifter or you're a powerlifting coach, the real thing, the noteworthy piece here isn't necessarily in the fact that you want your athlete to be immediately competing again straight away after, but more so in the importance of gathering that data and understanding what that information means for you as you go through multiple competitions and multiple peaks. We talk about it all the time. We'll constantly get the question, probably 2 or 3 times a week, from athletes saying, I'm just starting off the sport. How long should I wait before I compete? And this brings up the massively important thing of you should be competing immediately. You should be gathering all of that information and figuring out what works best for you, whether that's a powerlifting competition, weightlifting competition, whatever it is. That data, or if you were from a precision sports background, you'd call it dope data on previous engagements. This information is so valuable, and you can only gain this information by doing it yourself. Do you work slightly better with the slightly higher intensities? Do you work slightly better when you compete 2 or 3 competitions in a row? Obviously, there's rules that most people will fall into, but for you yourself, gathering that information, paying attention to that information, and then listening to that information moving forward is so, so valuable.
So the important thing to think about here when we're thinking about peaking for powerlifting is, what is the purpose of a peak? That is to show up at the competition in the best shape we can do and represent the work we've put into in that previous training block. So the peak isn't necessarily to make up for a bad training block. A good peak can't make up for bad training. But on the other side, the good news is a moderate to good peak will represent a really good training block. So it's very, very hard to actually mess up a great training block on the competition unless you go absolutely batshit crazy on your peak. So there's a lot of things you can do wrong and still have a great competition. So a bad peak after a great training block doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a bad competition day. So that's actually quite a good scenario to be in. So the rule of thumb when we're doing the powerlifting peak is just to ensure we don't do too much. We don't kill ourselves. Always err on the side of caution. And in this example, we can see John Haack talking about the squat. So he talks about doing 357.5 as his last squat. He ends up squatting 365 kilos in the competition. And if you watch the 357.5 kilo squat, it's not great. It's obviously an amazing squat, but relative to John Hack's own capacity, it doesn't look great. He said it didn't feel great. He said he didn't even want to think about taking it. He wasn't even too sure. He did end up taking it. So what the lifts you do in the peak isn't always a great representation of what would happen on the competition day, as everyone knows. Otherwise, we would pick our numbers exactly and we wouldn't be missing any attempts if we could tell from our peak what's going to happen. So the most important thing you need to do is you're dissipating fatigue and you're doing just enough volume and intensity to maintain your shape and allow for this realization phase to happen where you end up peaking for powerlifting. So that's some of the basic principles of periodization, whatever style of periodization you're subscribing to. Peaking for powerlifting is periodization's purest form. We're showing up in peak fitness. Now, a lot of maybe powerlifters aren't in peak fitness, but fitness in regards to sports science term is showing up for your competition and your specific sport in the best shape you can be in. So you need to reduce that volume, which is pretty fatiguing. We need to do just enough intensity to ensure we're staying in competition shape to maintain that stimulus. So we're trying to pick that fine line. So it's always best to err on the side of caution. If we go slightly too heavy, we can end up a little bit too fatigued. If we do too much volume, we can end up too fatigued. If we take too heavy attempts, we can wear off that psychological benefit. So when you're peaking for a powerlifting competition, it's always best to hold a lot back in. So do, for example, just enough to let you know that those weights are there within maybe 10, 15 kilos of your opener. Maybe sometimes you go a little bit heavier. This kind of harkens back to what Dara's talking about in regards to having data on your previous competitions. Some lifters kind of need to hit their last warm-up. Some lifters need to hit their first attempt. So it kind of depends on you as an individual in some circumstances. So you just need to ensure that you're not doing too much. Always be really cautious is the big thing to take away from your powerlifting peaks and those last heavy sessions. Now, I know John Haack hit a huge deadlift, but as he's an incredibly experienced lifter, he had an all-time PB deadlift, and then coming into the competition, he hit another all-time PB deadlift, one of the biggest deadlifts ever. But he is such a good competitor, and he knows himself so well. He would have known that taking that 420 was probably a good prelude to hitting that even bigger deadlift in competition. If you, for example, go and hit a PB deadlift in your powerlifting peak, you're probably going to have a really bad day. It's very, very fatiguing. And if it's an all-time PB, you're probably not going to have that psychological resources, let alone the physical resources, to go and hit another massive PB deadlift at the end of a squat and bench really long day of powerlifting. So the big takeaway from this is be cautious, just do enough, even just do a little bit less than you think you need to do, because for want of a better word, it can be there on the day. I know that's a cliche in the powerlifting kind of community where people will say it'll be there on the day, But if you have the work behind you, and if you've had a great training block and you've hit your volume PRs, you've hit your 5x3 PR, your 5x5 PR, your 3 singles PR, whatever that is, if they've gone up by 10, 15, 20 kilos, there's a great chance that you're going to have a good competition day. And the worst thing you can do is go too heavy in your powerlifting peak and take some of that away from what you were going to do in the comp. So big thing, just err on the side of caution, be conservative with that volume, be conservative with those singles. You can't make up for a terrible training block, so there's no point trying to force it on the peak.
Now, the last thing to talk about here is just the bench press. So obviously he went 8 out of 9 lifts. The bench press is an interesting one. Obviously, we talked about the momentum he had built up during that training block. We talked about how happy he was with his training. And then we talked about the in-competition kind of variables, the thing we can't control, what the refs are doing, how long that pause is going to be. He does mention that he was watching some of the earlier flights and sees slightly longer pauses as he's going throughout the competition, or slightly longer than normal pauses, which is something that he arguably said he kind of was worried about. Now, John Haack is a 600-pound bencher. He has a bench press that most people could never even dream of deadlifting. Now, small changes like this will obviously have an effect on him, but even for you, as you're at your powerlifting competition or as you're preparing for the powerlifting competition, it is very important that you're savvy to what's going on around you. So having that awareness, maybe you don't want to watch all the previous flights. Obviously you don't. It's a very loud environment to be in. It's a very stimulating environment to be in. You probably don't want to be in there all day, but certainly having an idea for what the refs' calls are like, what is the depth like on their squats, what's the pause like on those bench presses, what's the lockout call like on the deadlift. Make sure that is very well set in your mind before you go out onto the competition platform itself. Now, in this case, John missed this one lift, which then forced him to have to make a slightly heavier deadlift to make the total. He's obviously one of the greatest of all times. He's well able to do it. But for many of you, if you're competing to try and make nationals or make a qualifying total for another competition, then it will put you in a bad place if you've decided to make slightly larger jumps. So rather than a 10 kilo jump, you go for a 15 or 20 kilo jump. Now suddenly you miss your second attempt or your third attempt and you're 20 kilos behind where you hope to be going into the deadlift for the competition. So be wary of that. Be competition savvy. Have that mindset that you're competing in a sport, not just kind of competing against yourself. The last thing I wanted to mention then is just the fact that we're lucky enough to be witnessing one of the greatest athletes in the sport currently, but we're also seeing a massive upsurge in the overall quality of powerlifting, particularly raw powerlifting. We're really seeing it growing in recent years. And one of the main reasons for that is that we have top level athletes, and we've spoken about this before, with top level athletes competing against each other. Now, what I'd personally love to see is John going up into those heavier weight classes, maybe competing against some of those bigger guys, not cutting the weight, because it has been an issue in the last kind of 12 or 24 months for John, where a number of those weight cuts haven't gone great. I'd love to see what would happen if he either doesn't cut weight and just goes up a small amount, or else gains a lot of weight and goes up to those slightly heavier classes, and just see how big and how freakish those numbers can get.
So if you need help with your powerlifting training, head over to the Sika Strength app, where you can run our powerlifting program. You can run our individual programs, your squat, bench, or deadlift program, dynamic loading adjustment, coach bot, video library, 2 programs per month for the price of the subscription. Everyone gets a 7-day free trial when you sign up to the app, so you can have a look around, check out the programs. Just cancel it before the end of the 7 days and you won't be charged anything. We have people of all experience levels running those programs. The powerlifting program literally has people doing 100 kilo benches, 120 kilo squats, all the way up to people hitting 300 kilo deadlifts, 300 kilo squats, and massive benches as well. So it is fit for all those numbers. So check it out in the links below. And every week we do a Facebook live stream on our group to make sure that we're there in person, Dara and I together, to ensure that those athletes have questions, maybe about your technique or about training, to help you along so you're not left adrift in the sea. But I will say the app takes care of a lot of your problems.